The presence of Nazis and white supremacists assaulting people at your protest. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I don't like Nazis.
Then why are you?
Why were they here?
Well, how can I answer
Are there views in alignment with yours? At some point, you have to realize.
I think that's a foolish question. Look, if you want to know what my views are,
I've watched all of your videos. Yes.
Including
yes, I have.
Yes.
Then why would you ask such a question?
Because this is my interpretation of your videos.
Apparently,
all of the people who arranged the protest against you watched all of your videos.
It's like, do you want to disavow?
I have 150 videos on YouTube.
No, your lectures, which sparked the debate.
Okay.
Do you want to disavow the support?
Could you let me talk to her for a moment?
Don't call me that, please.
So, I have 150 lectures on YouTube. There's 500 hours of my views.
Do you really think that you're worth all of that time?
So look, I will answer your question, okay? I've studied Nazism for a very long time. It's been 4 decades, and I understand it very well. And I can tell you that there's some awful people lurking in the corners, and they're ready to come out. And if the radical left keeps pushing the way
that sounds very much like a
they're
threat.
going to come.
That sounds very much like a threat. That sounds very much like a threat. Would you like to disavow the physical violence? Trans people were physically assaulted at this rally in your name. Would you like to disavow that violence?
Yes.
So you wish that didn't happen, and you want to, and I'm going to post this online that you would like people to not to be more accommodating of trans people and people of color at your events in future.
I would like there to be no violence.
I'm a person of color, and I felt very accommodating here. I felt like my voice. Thank you very much.
I'm also a former Muslim, and I feel like this guy is the best.
You wanted to disavow. You wanted to disavow, and this is the disavowal. I am not an advocate of violence. I'm speaking out the way I'm speaking out because I think this is a route to no violence. And violence is lurking. And you can say that sounds like a threat.
There was no violence at our protest, though. There was violence at your protest. So what does that say about our views?
It's not my protest. You know, asking me continually freighted questions isn't very helpful if you actually want to have a dialogue. You have no idea if I'm your enemy. You have no idea about me.
You won't use my pronouns, so I'm pretty sure you're my enemy, yes.
Yeah, well, I know you think that, but I don't believe that using your pronouns is going to do you any good in the long run. I think it'll do quite the contrary.
What the?
Is that your medical opinion?
What, is that your medical opinion? Like, you are aware that non-binary people are valid in the American Psychological Association.
Is that your opinion?
Yes, it is.
No, it's not.
It's about non-binary pronouns.
No, it's not.
Yeah, I'm saying that that's what I'm about.
Rally? Were you there when I spoke?
Yes. I've been here for this whole thing.
Okay, well, I don't know that. It's a genuine question. Look, I think that's what's happening is that we're pushing over a line we shouldn't cross. The newest legislation is requiring people to use.
But you are aware that that's being put in place so that we can't get fired. We need to be written into the Canada human rights legislation, or we can be fired for our gender identity. Well, then why'd you make a fucking video about it? I've been denied housing as a trans person. These rights would protect me.
Denied housing?
I've been denied housing.
From the state or for the open market? So have you been denied housing, like, from the government?
It's illegal either way if we had human rights.
From the government?
Or
have you tried to get a house like everybody else and they said, no, you're weird, you can't work? No, if the state's done that, that's a problem. But if someone doesn't want to live with you, that's their right.
They said, no, you're trans. Really sure so no, if I had human rights, that wouldn't have fucking happened.
You're weird. I don't want to live with schizophrenic
As far as I'm concerned, that's a terrible thing. It's too bad that that's happened.
So you don't want us to, but you don't want us to have protections in the human rights bill that will allow me to have employment, allow me to have housing security, allow me to have medical care. That's what this is about. It's not about infringing on your rights or making you learn a new fucking pronoun.
I don't think that's what it's about. What evidence do you have that attempting to transform the way that people use pronouns is going to produce a positive effect on society?
Are you aware that there is a trans boy who killed himself in psychiatric care recently because he was continuously being misgendered by his care workers?
And that is my precise problem.
And there have been multiple recorded instances of trans people killing themselves because they are not being integrated into society. We are not looking for special treatment. We are looking to be able to integrate ourselves into society. And if you refuse to refer to us by our pronouns, which is not allowed to ask, singular they pronouns go all the way back to Shakespeare. It's not a new thing. If you refuse to let us integrate ourselves into society, you create alienation that results in suicide. We are in a suicide epidemic right now. What are you contributing to this as a psychologist?
Man, you know, you're almost impossible to talk to. You're so full of rhetoric that it's impossible to listen to you. I would be more than happy to listen to you.
Yeah, really?
I was devoid of rhetoric. And yes, actually, I don't really think I am a rhetorician. Just so you know that. And you know, it's very hard to listen to you. I mean, it's very hard to attend to you because you rattle on with your ideological speech.
It's not ideological.
No, I said that right from the beginning. What I said at the beginning was that I was not going to cede the linguistic territory to radical leftists, regardless of whether or not it was put in law. That's what I said. And then the people who came after me said, oh, you must be transphobic and you'd mistreat a student in your class. It's like, I never mistreated a student in my class. I'm not transphobic, and that isn't what I said.
Well, except you've also called trans campaigners authoritarian, haven't you? I mean, isn't that grossly...
Well, only in the broader context of my claims that radical leftist ideologues are authoritarian,
yes,
which they are.
You're saying someone who's trying to work out their gender identity, who may well have struggled with that, had quite a tough time over the years.
With it, yeah.
You're comparing them with, you know, Chairman Mao, who saw the deaths of millions of people. Well, even if the activists, you know, they're trans people too. They have a right to say these things.
Yeah, but they don't have a right to speak for their whole community.
To compare them to Chairman Mao or, you know, Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet. I mean, you know, this is grossly insensitive.
No, I didn't compare them to Pinochet.
Well,
I did compare them to
He was an authoritarian.
He's a right-winger, though. I was comparing them to the left-wing totalitarians. Okay. And I do believe they are left-wing totalitarians.
Under Mao, millions of people died.
Right.
I mean, there's no comparison between Mao and a trans activist, is there?
Why not?
Because trans activists aren't killing millions of people?
The philosophy that's guiding their utterances is the same philosophy.
The consequences are...
Not yet.
You're saying that trans activists could lead to the deaths of millions of people?
No, I'm saying that the philosophy that drives their utterances is the same philosophy that already has driven us to the deaths of millions of people.
Okay, tell us how that philosophy is in any way comparable.
Sure, that's no problem. The first thing is that the philosophy presumes that group identity is paramount. That's the fundamental philosophy that drove the Soviet Union and Maoist China. And it's the fundamental philosophy of the left-wing activists. It's identity politics. It doesn't matter who you are as an individual. It matters who you are in terms of your group identity.
You're just saying these things, though, to provoke, aren't you? I mean, you are a provocateur.
I never say
You're like
anything.
the alt-right that you hate to be compared to. You want to stir things up.
I'm only a provocateur insofar as...
what would you say Trump's IQ really is? Does 160 seem reasonable?
No.
This will be quoted in...
No, 160 is really, really high.
Yeah.
I mean, the typical... The smart person that you're likely to meet in your life has an IQ of around 145.
Yeah.
160 is getting pretty damn rare. And Trump's old, and IQ goes down with age, fluid IQ, although crystallized IQ either stays the same or goes up slightly. So he isn't the problem solver or the learner that he was when he was 20. No one is. If you're in good physical shape, that helps a lot. His IQ is clearly well above average. I don't know, and he's done complex things in his life, and a lot of them. And that indicates that there's something to him, you know, and he hasn't been successful just in one domain. He's been successful in multiple complex domains, each of which were quite difficult. It's very difficult to be a reality TV star that's successful, right? It's very difficult to work in the construction business, and especially on large projects. And I know he's had his economic ups and downs, but he stayed in the game for a long time, very stressful. He's very stress resistant. So he's no dummy. I mean, it's nice to always think that your political opponent is just stupid, but he's done too many complex things for me to assume that he's somehow, if he wasn't smart, he couldn't have done those things.
Yeah, I'm glad you're acknowledging that, because when I see the people that are in hysteric mode and just saying he's this evil nutbag who doesn't know what he's doing and all this stuff, it just seems like such a lazy way of thinking about it. You don't have to like any of the things. You may not like the way he speaks or any of that, but the idea that somehow this is a dumb person, I think, is discounting of just the way humans have to work. This is interesting from Super Chat. Do you have any...
Well, he also won the presidency.
Right.
With a completely original campaign. And it's like, and without spending much money. It's like, okay, is he lucky? Because is that what you're saying? It's just lucky.
Right.
Well, I don't think it was just luck. It was at least maybe, well, it looked at least to some degree like courage. Maybe it was just blind, throwing caution to the wind. You know, I don't know if he ever expected that he could possibly win.
Yeah, and as I'm sure you'd argue, it probably had a little something to do with all those things, that maybe there was some courage, but that he also surrounded himself with people who maybe understood politics more than he did. Or
well, he could obviously, he can also obviously read a crowd.
Yeah.
Because he was appealing to crowds. And that was partly because he did, I think, try to say what he thought. Now, you could criticize what he thought, and that's fine. But he also didn't prepare the same speech. You know, he didn't prepare a speech and then deliver the same one everywhere, which I think is, I really find that rather reprehensible for people to do that.
Yeah.
Because they're
They're parroting themselves, or someone else writes their speeches, which is something I can't even imagine.
I can't. For what we do, I can't even fathom it, actually. I think.
Ask and it shall be given you. Seek and ye shall find. Knock and it shall be opened unto you. For everyone that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. That sounded pretty optimistic again. But again, I think it's a description of the structure of existential reality. And by which I mean, when I'm in my clinical practice and I observe, and this is also the case with my students, is let's say, people's lives aren't what they would like them to be. And so then you ask, why? Well, forget about tragedy and catastrophe, because that's self-evident, and we're not going to discuss that. Although the degree to which you bring about your own tragedy is always indeterminate. But I would never say that every terrible thing that is visited on a person is something they deserved. I think that that's a very dangerous presupposition, especially because everyone gets sick and everyone dies. But one of the main reasons that people don't get what they want is because they don't actually figure out what it is. And the probability that you're going to get what would be good for you, let's say, which would even be better than what you want, right? Because, you might be wrong about what you want easily. But maybe you could get what would really be good for you. Well, why don't you? Well, because you don't try. You don't think, okay, here's what I would like if I could have it. And I don't mean in a way that you manipulate the world to force it to deliver you goods for status or something like that. That isn't what I mean. I mean something like, imagine that you were taking care of yourself like you were someone you actually cared for. And then you thought, okay, I'm caring for this person. I would like things to go as well for them as possible. What would their life have to be like in order for that to be the case? Well, people don't do that. They don't sit down and think, all right, let's figure it out. You've got a life. It's hard, obviously. It's like 3 years from now, you can have what you need. You've got to be careful about it. You can't have everything. You can have what would be good for you, but you have to figure out what it is, and then you have to aim at it. Well, my experience with people has been if they figure out what it is that would be good for them, and then they aim at it, then they get it. And it's strange because it's a strange thing. It's not quite that simple because, you may formulate an idea about what would be good for you, and then you take 10 steps towards that, and you find out that your formulation was a bit off, and so you have to reformulate your goal. So you're kind of going like this as you move towards the goal. But a huge part of the reason that people fail is because they don't ever set up the criteria for success. And so, since success is a very narrow line and very unlikely, the probability that you're going to stumble on it randomly is 0. And so there's a proposition here, and the proposition...
But does it bother you that your audience is predominantly male? Isn't that a bit divisive?
And
so you're saying women have some sort of duty to sort of help fix the crisis of masculinity.
So if you want domination...
women want to dominate, is that what you're saying?
No.
But what gives you the right to say that? I mean, maybe that's how women want their relationships, those women. I mean, you're making these vast generalizations.
I'm a clinical psychologist.
You're saying you've done your research and women are unhappy dominating men. You're saying there's a crisis of masculinity? I mean, what do you do about it? But you're saying basically it doesn't matter if women aren't getting to the top. You're saying, well, that's just a fact of life. Women aren't necessarily going to get to the top. You're saying it's a fact of life.
I'm saying there are multiple reasons for it.
I'm saying that 9% pay gap exists.
Yeah.
That's a gap between men and women. I'm not saying why it exists, but it exists. Now, if you're a woman, that seems pretty unfair.
You have to say why it exists.
Again, a vast generalization. Some women are not more agreeable than men.
Yes, that's true, but that's right. And some women get paid more than men.
So you're saying that by and large, women are too agreeable to get the pay rises they deserve. But you're saying it's not because of gender, it's because women are too agreeable to ask for pay rises. And you're saying if it's at the cost of men, that's a problem. But why shouldn't women have the right to choose not to have children or the right to choose those demanding careers?
They do.
But you're saying that makes them unhappy. You're saying it makes them miserable. I think I take issue with the idea of the typical woman because, all women are different.
I mean, people are treated pretty fairly in Western culture already, but we can improve
they're really not, though, are they? So you're saying women are just more sensible. They don't want... Right, so you're saying that anyone who believes in equality, whether you call them feminists, call them whatever you want to call them, should basically give up because it ain't going to happen. So you're saying give people equality of opportunity, that's fine, but still women aren't going to make it. That's what you're really saying.
Because in Scandinavia...
What do you mean by that? Equality of outcome is undesirable. Say, I mean, are we going back to the dark ages?
That's because they're actually not listening. They're
I'm listening very
projecting
carefully, and I'm
think.
hearing you basically saying women need to just accept they're never going to make it on equal terms. Equal outcomes is how you defined it.
No, I didn't say that.
If I was a young woman watching that, I would go, well, I might as well just go and play with my Cindy dolls and give up trying at school because I'm not going to get the top job I want because there's someone sitting there saying it's not possible and it's not desirable, it's going to make you miserable.
Desirable. That's what I said.
Fine, you're saying that's fine.
No, I really
think the patriarchal system is just fine.
That's silly. I do. I think that's silly.
Successful women, though, basically have to wear the trousers, in your view. They have to sort of become men to succeed, is what you're saying. Is it not desirable to have some of those female traits you're talking about? I'd say that's a generalization, but you've used the words female traits. Is it not desirable to have some of them at the top of business? I mean, maybe there wouldn't have been
don't predict success.
banking.
And so does high negative emotion.
You're saying that women aren't intelligent enough to run these top companies?
No.
You got in trouble for refusing to call trans men and women by their preferred personal pronouns.
No, that's not actually true.
You cited freedom of speech in that. Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. You know, like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Except you haven't sat there and... I'm just trying to work that out. I mean...
Ha, gotcha.
You have got me. I'm trying to work that through in my head. Yeah, it took a while.
It did, yeah.
It took a while. A trans person in your class has come to your class and said they want to be called
That's never happened. And I would call them she.
You're saying someone who's trying to work out their gender identity, who may well have struggled with that, had quite a tough time over the years.
With it, yeah.
You're comparing them with, Chairman Mao, who saw the deaths of millions of people. Well, even if the activists, they're trans people too. They have a right to say these things.
Yeah, but they don't have a right to speak for their whole community.
To compare them to Chairman Mao or... Augusto Pinochet. I mean, this is grossly insensitive.
I didn't compare them to Pinochet.
Under Mao, millions of people died.
Right.
I mean, there's no comparison between Mao and a trans activist, is there?
Why not?
Because trans activists aren't killing millions of people?
The philosophy that's guiding their utterances is the same philosophy.
The consequences are...
Not yet.
You're saying that trans activists could lead to the deaths of millions of people?
I'm saying that the philosophy that drives their utterances is the same philosophy that already has driven us to the deaths of millions of people.
Okay, tell us how that philosophy is in any way comparable.
Sure, that's no problem. The first thing is that the philosophy presumes that group identity is paramount. That's the fundamental philosophy that drove the Soviet Union and Maoist China. And it's the fundamental philosophy of the left-wing activists. It's identity politics. It doesn't matter who you are as an individual. It matters who you are in terms of your group identity.
You're just saying these things, though, to provoke, aren't you? I mean, you are a provocateur.
I never say
You're like
anything.
the alt-right that you hate to be compared to.
Everyone I hate is a literal Nazi, literal Nazi, literal Nazi.
Aren't you just whipping people up into a state of anger? And
not at all.
So you're saying, like the lobsters, we're hardwired as men and women to do certain things, to sort of run along tram lines, and there's nothing we can do about it. Let me just get this straight. You're saying that we should organise our societies along the lines of the lobsters?
No, I'm not saying that at all.
Well, it is a controversial topic on a Toronto University campus this month. Some people on the campus saying pronouns like he, she, him, or her do not represent them accurately. Now, the university wants staff to use alternate pronouns, but Jordan Peterson is a psychology professor at the university, and he is refusing to do that. Take a look at this.
The reason I'm defending freedom of speech is because that's how people with different opinions settle their opinions in a civil society.
Peterson, do you have any comments on the Nazi presence at your protest? The presence of Nazis and white supremacists assaulting people at your protest. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I don't like Nazis. I'm speaking out the way I'm speaking out because I think this is a route to no violence. And violence is lurking. And you can say that that sounds like a threat.
There was no violence at our protest, though.
I just asked, would you refer to me, if it wasn't for this law, and I asked you to refer to me with they, them pronouns, would you? And your answer was no.
Not if I was compelled to.
But we're saying...
So just an example of how things have become heated at the University of Toronto. That scene showing different groups of students, some confronting the professor about his position, others supporting him. Now, Peterson says this is about free speech, but A.W. Pete is also a professor at the University of Toronto who says that Peterson's language is abusive. Joining us right now is Professor Jordan Peterson, as well as Professor A.W. Pete. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks.
Professor Peterson, let's begin with you. Why are you against the use of alternate pronouns?
I'm against the use of legislation to determine what words that myself and other people are required to utter.
But would you use alternate pronouns if a student asked you to?
I think I've made my position on that clear already.
Well, perhaps not to our audience at home who are just being introduced to this. Would you use alternate pronouns? And why not?
Because I don't believe that other people have the right to determine what language I use, especially when it's backed by punitive legislation. And when the words that are being required are the constructions, they're artificial constructions of people I regard as radical ideologues whose viewpoint I do not share.
Well, we have a graphic to show our audience at home, just some of the pronouns being used or asked to be used as alternates. Among them you see here Z or Zim, Z or here, Z or Zir, also hey, or A rather, and per. So just some of the alternate pronouns there. Professor Pete, when you hear Professor Peterson saying that this is oppressive, how do you respond to that?
The Peterson drama has done real harm to real people on campus. He's made it harder to be transgender or non-binary. I know this from personal experience. I'm non-binary and transgender, and I know how it's felt to be on the U of T campus for the last month. And I also know from private communications with other affected people. You know, in New Zealand, where I grew up, academics have a statutory role enshrined in the Education Act to be a critic and conscience of society. So I think that's an idea worth exporting to Canada. So I'd like to give Peterson about a B+ for his critic role recently, and an F for the conscience part. A student once said to me when I finally obtained tenure, "Now, Professor, now that you have obtained superpowers, you must agree to use them for good, for peace and justice." So I invite Peterson to start doing more of that.
Well, Professor Peterson, those who are asking for this alternate use of alternate pronouns, they are saying it boils down to respecting their human rights. How do you respond to that?
I don't think it boils down to respecting their human rights. I think that it's an imposition on freedom of speech that's being implemented at a legislative level. I also think that if there was a naturally evolving solution to the linguistic problem that's being posed by a small fraction of the transgender community, that people would have already adopted it. We've never had a situation in the usage of English before that required legislation to produce a transformation in the manner in which people spoke. Has a very dangerous precedent. So it's one thing to tell people what they can't say. So, for example, we have legislation making it illegal to do such things as deny the Holocaust. It's a completely different thing to demand that people use certain words when they're formulating their own ideas. And I mean, it's also absurd. I mean, here's one thing that's happened that I don't believe the formulators of this legislation ever foresaw. So in New York City, for example, there are now 31 protected gender identities. And I see no reason whatsoever why each of those gender identities can't demand the use of their own pronoun. And that absurd things like that have been happening on the University of Michigan campus, for example, where students have been given permission to tell faculty members and others what pronouns they're to be addressed by. And they're multiplying rapidly out of control. So the law is bad from an ethical perspective. It's sloppily written. And besides that, the solution that it imposes is practically untenable.
Well, sorry, excuse me for jumping in, but I want to bring in Professor Pete here because we did show those words to our audience.
When we're talking about whether you can force someone to refer to you or refrain from referring to you in different ways, I guess one issue that I'm having difficulty with is what a pronoun is. I think we'd all acknowledge that you have a right to force people to refer to you in certain ways. If a professor had a class and they had a student who insisted on calling them a girl when they were male, or calling them queer or something, or I can think of way worse words, they would say, well, that's not a pronoun, that's a derogatory label that's just meant to degrade me. But if, who's to say what is a pronoun? And I'm not sure that it necessarily would change if 95 or 97 friends all insisted on sort of degrading or, using that pejorative label to the person. And I think that people who are transgendered or whatever do experience, when people use the wrong gender labels to them, they've experienced real prejudice. They experience it as kind of oppressive in that way. So I don't know if identity is a subject or an object, but I do know that we place important demands on one another. I don't know about nature, but I know that fundamentally, like, our society is going to work better if we respect each other, and I think history bears that out. That self-respect and allowing people's self-identification to play a role in that public aspect. We do already have limits on how people can refer to each other, and they're informed by how people want themselves to be referred to.
Okay. Well, that's a lot of questions. So, and that's, I'm not trying to be a smart aleck about that. It's just, I'm going to have to sort that out for a minute. Well, the first thing I would say is, pronouns, and I'm not a linguist, so I'm not going to be able to whip this off the top of my head, although I do know that there is a psychologist named James Pennebaker who's written a whole book on pronouns, which you might be interested in referring to, and pronouns turn out to be extraordinarily important as signifiers, but they're also part of what's called a closed linguistic category, and they don't change. And so that's something that's useful to know. But you also bring up the distinction, or the lack of distinction, or made a lack of distinction between adjectives and pronouns. And that's pretty interesting, because there's no real reason why, if you can't insist upon which pronoun I use to address you, you can't also insist on which adjective I use to address you. And there's a lot more adjectives. And so that's, because I don't see, like, if you can choose your damn pronoun, why can't you choose your adjective? I mean, adjectives are, the words you listed as pejorative were actually not pronouns, they were adjectives. And so you can object to them. And there's no shortage of times when you use a pejorative adjective to describe someone, especially if you believe that they've misbehaved. It's like, if the person can insist upon their pronoun, why can't they insist upon their adjective? And that's another part of this problem with this multiplicative complexity that it isn't addressed properly within the law. With regards to respect, you said, well, human civilization progresses a lot better if we respect one another, and I actually don't believe that at all. I believe that human civilization progresses and maintains itself when we respect people who've earned respect. You don't just respect everybody randomly. Well, what the hell use is respect if you just respect people randomly? It's like inflating the currency, It's like the Simpsons episode where, Bart gets a trophy because it's every child gets a trophy day. All you do is inflate the currency. Respect is actually limited to that category of people who have earned respect in some manner. So whatever you're talking about with regards to, say, common decency between people, it's not respect. And the definitions actually matter. They matter a lot. And so I hear the respect argument all the time, but you also can't force me to respect you. You might be able to force me to act like I respect you, but you can't force me to respect you. It's just not possible. You could break me, I suppose, and then perhaps I would do it, although I can't see exactly how precisely. But so there's a number of, I get your point, and I'm not trying to denigrate it in any sense. There's a complex issue here, which is, to what degree do you allow individuals to govern the conversation that's had about them in their presence or otherwise. But I would just revert back to my original argument, which is that's a negotiation. It's either a negotiation. You got 3 states. You can negotiate with someone. You can be their slave, or you can be their tyrant. And I would pick negotiation, but as far as I'm concerned, the law right now, as it's currently instantiated, is a tyrant, and it makes people into its slave, and we're going to pay for that. And it's predicated on, hypothetically, on respect and compassion. I don't buy that for a second.
people like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, they assume that the natural person is the civilized creature that you see before you in a discussion like this. But I don't believe that. I think that people are far crazier and far more destructive and far greater as well than the typical rationalist approach. Rationality is a surface facade. That's all. And the idea that people will eventually be rational, it's much more likely that they will be irrational than rational. And you could say, for example, that Catholicism, let's say, for all its irrationality, was as rational as people can get. If you remove that level of irrationality, that's structural, say, then everything falls apart and people get so irrational, you can't believe it. Not more rational. You know, because they, like Harrison and his crowd, think that we were superstitious for thousands of years. Kind of savage and superstitious. And then all of a sudden the Enlightenment came along in the scientific revolution, and poof, we got rational. And since then things have been good. And that's not how it looks to me at all. I don't buy that. I think that our rationality, as I said already, our rationality, even our science, is nested inside this larger metaphysical structure. This is also something that Carl Jung would be an advocate of. That there's an irrational, pragmatic, I would say evolutionarily determined ethic underneath this rationality. And when it goes, then all that rationality goes too. So, yes, you can be a non-believer. But the funny thing about that is, too, you can't be a non-believer in your action, you see, because Harris's metaphysics is fundamentally Christian. So he acts out a Christian metaphysics, but he says, well, I don't believe it. It's like, well, yeah, you do, because you're acting it out. You just say you don't believe it, but you believe it.
What do you mean he's acting it out? Like what, for example?
Well, he doesn't rob banks, doesn't kill people, doesn't rape, doesn't murder, you know. I mean, look, in Crime and Punishment, for example.
So you think when you don't do those things, basically the underpinning of it, even though I think, I can't speak for Sam, and you guys have had, by the way, regardless of where we get with this, you guys have had, I think, two great conversations, one where you didn't quite get there, but one where you've come together, and I suspect you both really relish in that, right? I mean, at the end of the day, this is someone that you respect, whether you disagree with or not.
Look, I mean...
Yeah, I just think that's important to preface, because everyone is so at each other's throats all the time, that when I saw two people that I respect just disagreeing on things, but really trying to get there, I thought, this is good. And yet there's a certain amount of people that that want you guys to tear each other apart.
Well, there's a good case to be made for atheism. I mean, let's make no bones about it. I actually think it's an easier case to make than the alternative. Because you could say, in some sense, there's been 300, 400 years of brilliant scientists who've been doing nothing but laying the foundation for an objective, empirical atheism. So it's an unbelievably powerful argument. But it's not going to lead to the rule of rationality. See, I don't believe that. I don't believe that. Because
do you think anything could get you there? Do you think that somebody could lay out a case that could eventually turn you on this the same way you would want someone like Sam to come around to what you're saying? Do you think that's even in the realm of possibility?
I can't see how, because it's not like I haven't thought these things through. I mean, I am a scientist. You know, I understand the scientific worldview. In fact, everything that I am saying and thinking about religion is nested inside an evolutionary viewpoint, an evolutionary biology viewpoint, and an evolutionary psychology viewpoint. So I do believe there's a fundamental contrast between a Darwinian worldview and a Newtonian worldview, which is the worldview that I think Sam Harris and his crowd basically have. He didn't agree with that, and it's complicated.
Yeah.
But see, I guess in some sense, I'm more romantic in temperament than Sam, and I think than his followers too. And because of that, I can see the irrational and malevolent side of human beings, I believe, much more clearly than they can. And I also think I have far more experience with that sort of thing.
Yeah, so do you think that, so I don't want to get too lost here, but so we'll try to wrap it up here, because there's so much I want to do with you here. So let's say Earth is crumbling, we have two ships. We're going to send the people that believe what you're saying here, basically, that we need this sort of religious underpinning. And then the Dawkins, Sam people, they're going to take their 100 people, you're going to take your 100 people. We're going to go to 2 different planets and set things up the way they should be. You know, blank slate for each. I guess the part that I would struggle with here is to understand how their ship lands, they're rooted in science and in basic liberalism and acceptance of others and all that, how that society would not flourish from the base level if we could just reset. Now, I think you could make a great argument that we can't do it here because there's just so much history here and all that stuff. But if we were just resetting on another place, why could we not do it that way and have it work?
Well, first of all, you know, there's an assumption that science and the scientific worldview in some sense has won